This is lecture 26. We'll finish off the topic of anabolic steroids, what we introduced last time, and introduced all those arguments against them. We'll go through all of those today. So these are the three topics. We will cover some physiology, talking about the liver and the heart and the interactions with steroids. And then the rest of the time is going to be going through those ethical arguments. So this one we'll start with athletes' health. And this one is that steroids should be illegal because it affects the health of the user. So, we should throw them in jail for owning steroids, for using steroids. But it's worth considering who the victim is or what the crime is. That's Thomas Jefferson down at the bottom. And the quotation is, he just didn't care what anyone's religion was. And the full quotation is, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And that's the premise with steroids. If we were concerned with the athlete's health, then anything with comparably adverse effects should also be banned if we're going to be consistent about it. Um, Carb loading with peeps, that's a straight shot to diabetes, and that may be more harmful than the steroids. So, is are peeps available for legislation here too? We don't get to tell other people what life choices they get to make that only affects themselves. Now, if you are doing drugs to me or I'm doing drugs to you, there's a different conversation that needs to take place. But inflicting harm on ourselves isn't something that seems wise to criminalize. People just they get to choose to eat a lot of birthday cake if they want to. You can choose to drink yourself to death. You can smoke yourself into lung cancer. Aside from maybe health insurance costs that would affect other people, it does me no injury if my neighbor believes there are 20 gods or eats 30 birthday cakes a day. And so legislating against that. Also, we'd have to ban sedentary behavior, right? That's worse than steroids in terms of the outcomes, is sedentary behavior. But you can't tell people they have to walk on treadmills or they can't drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes. Um, and they can't be super stressed out, even though these have clear health consequences, all of them. And looking at the actual pharmacological agents, you can kill yourself with Tylenol, right? If you abuse it, you can kill yourself with vitamins if you abuse them. You can kill yourself with water if you drink too much. That happens somewhat regularly. Now, the argument is like, oh, it's way easier to abuse steroids than it is to abuse Tylenol, but that's not even close to true. The study behind this guy showed acetaminophen, Tylenol, to be the leading cause of acute liver failure in the United States, much more than alcohol. 2 years later, another study, same finding. Tylenol overdoses, these are just rampant, and it doesn't take that much. Um, and acetaminophen is not just in Tylenol, it's in lots of other drugs as well, which is why people keep overdosing. But year after year, the same findings over and over. Half of all acute liver failure cases are Tylenol, acetaminophen specifically. Here's a 2016 article that talks about the problem of acetaminophen being like a political issue now, and it just continues to worsen. The rates of hospitalizations related to it continue to increase, and Tylenol isn't illegal, even though its side effects are terrible. Not as terrible as ibuprofen in some other domains, but ibuprofen doesn't kill you quickly in the way that Tylenol does. And there are lots of reports out there about steroid side effects that aren't grounded in the truth. They just make these unsupported, extremely exaggerated claims. So you have to filter through some of those to get to the truth. But the liver that's one site where anabolic androgenic steroids have side effects. And so the liver is where you control your lipids, your HDLs, your LDLs, that profile. And if you eat the steroids, if you take pills, if you swallow them, they go to your liver. That's portal circulation or quote first pass hepatic metabolism, right? So that's what it's called. Whatever you eat, the first stop before it gets into systemic circulation, the first stop is going to be your liver. So if you eat the steroids, if you eat Anabolic steroids, they will worsen your lipid profile. And you see the opposite effect when women take estrogen orally, except they can bypass those changes if they take the estrogen by other means, either injections or suppository or patches or something. Um, but the elevations in HDL that come with estrogen, you actually don't see that corresponding to reductions in the risk of heart attacks usually. But if you eat it, the first stop is going to be the liver, and that will affect your lipids. Now, if you take testosterone intramuscularly, right, inject it. That's what intramuscular means, as opposed to orally. This is a Paul Thompson study. I mentioned Paul Thompson in the last lecture, and he'll come up again in this one. But he found oral administration of stanozolol. We talked about stanozolol in the last lecture. That's the Ben Johnson drug. Lowered HDL levels by a third, right? After a week of administration, a 33% reduction in HDLs. But that's oral stanozolol. Yeah, oral stanozolol. And so what happens to the lipid profile is, I mean, that's really one of the worst side effects of anabolic steroids. But it's only if you eat the steroids. So here's a comparison to intramuscular injection of testosterone. And you see the lipid profile actually improves a tiny bit by taking anabolic steroids. So the LDLs went down with the injected testosterone. HDLs pretty much stayed the same. The green lines, those are oral stanozolol. The orange lines are injected testosterone. Now, other stuff can happen in the liver too. It's not just control over the lipids. So if the first metabolic checkpoint for anabolic steroids and whatever else you eat is the liver, um, it's like the liver really, it doesn't like anabolic steroids. And you can see that if you just take a blood test and look for AST and ALT levels, uh, aspartate aminotransferase and alanine aminotransferase. Those are just liver enzymes, and they'll be elevated in the blood if the liver is under stress. And lots of things can cause liver stress. But if you're taking oral anabolic steroids, you will see those enzymes in the blood, meaning the liver is unhappy in those moments. And that'll happen to pretty much everybody. Anybody who takes oral steroids, you will see the liver experience stress. But the liver heals really well when people go off of steroids or they go off of whatever is damaging it, unless you just totally destroy the liver. What it doesn't heal well from is pileosis hepatis. That's not hepatitis, it's hepatis. And this is blood-filled cysts that form on the liver, and this is really rare, but it can happen. And if those cysts rupture, that's a really bad place to bleed. You can't really stop it there. But this is a look at how rare it is to get. It was on an episode of House MD. That's a medical drama. If you don't know, it's a medical drama from the early 2000s until the early 2010s that focused on really rare medical conditions. And there was a knight at a Renaissance fair who did like jousting and whatever fencing and stuff. And he did steroids to impress the like what like country wench or buxom lass or whatever the Renaissance vernacular would be. He was doing steroids to impress that person, and then he got pileosis hepatis. But just remember that Tylenol is more dangerous if we're talking livers. And so if you think this is sufficient grounds that the oral steroids can affect the liver, sufficient grounds to make it illegal, if you're so concerned about livers, you can't bias your banning, right? Tylenol can't escape the same legislation, but injectable steroids can because they don't have those effects because they bypass first pass hepatic metabolism. Okay, moving into the heart. Again, you see Paul Thompson here as the lead author. And left ventricular hypertrophy, that's what people claim anabolic steroids will do. If you're taking them, that left ventricle, the wall really thickens. And the use of anabolic steroids might associate with a very slight thickening of the wall, which potentially could be problematic, but you'd have to do a ton of drugs to do that. And if you adjust for whole body muscle mass, the heart really isn't much bigger. So if you were to gain 20 pounds of lean mass, let's say, not from drugs, just from heavy lifting for a while, you gain 20 pounds of lean mass, your heart would have to remodel itself to compensate. And once it did, it really wouldn't look any different from the steroid heart. Now, that doesn't mean that left ventricular hypertrophy isn't a big deal. It's just not that big of a deal when it's induced in this way, because the wall won't be nearly as thick as the genetic condition of left ventricular hypertrophy. But you will see a little bit of heart wall thickening. Um, it's just the same amount of thickening you'd see if you got there naturally. Like if it takes you 6 months to get there with steroids or a year without steroids, your heart really arrives in the same place in the end. But the more important question is not the architecture. It's not like, what do those dimensions look like? It's whether those dimensions impair function, because nobody cares about architectural differences if the function is the same. So again, the meaningful question is, do steroids affect functional differences in the heart? And the answer is no, they don't, right? So here's another study. It's the same thing, with doses 10 to 20 times the recommended value. You're not seeing functional differences. The red passage at the top right, that's a quotation from the article. And they just didn't find any differences between steroid users and controls in large doses. 18 years later, same basic study, same findings. Chronic anabolic steroid users, right? There's no difference or a minimal effect on size, function, and stiffness. So this isn't just one-off steroid users. These are chronic anabolic steroid users. Now, if you do steroids here for 9 consistent years and the doses are, quote, remarkable, the heart might not squeeze quite as well. Had you been doing remarkable doses of Tylenol, though, for 9 years, you would have died 9 years ago. Had you been doing remarkable doses of ibuprofen for 9 years, you'd wish you would have died 9 years ago. Your stomach would have just rotted out, right? You have like no guts left. So the point is, a lot of the effects of anabolic steroids have been exaggerated over the years. Now, if we want to talk about the dangers of steroids in sport, um, it's the sports themselves, right? Not the steroids that are really injuring people. The number of catastrophic injuries in football and hockey and boxing, MMA and cheerleading, tons of catastrophic injuries in cheerleading. The sports themselves are causing way more harm than steroids. And I'm not sure who's making the argument that because sports injure way more athletes than steroids do, sports should be illegal. I'm not hearing those arguments. So nobody really cares about the harm of steroids, right? Nobody cares about Mark McGuire's liver or Barry Bonds' heart or whatever contemporary athlete examples. Nobody cares about that stuff. They care about home runs. And androstenedione, that was the drug, that was the androgen, right? Precursor to testosterone. That was the androgen that Mark McGuire was doing when he set the record in home runs. It was totally legal then. You could go to GNC, you could go to any supplement store, and you could just purchase it. And then in January of 2005, it was made illegal. And it's worth wondering, had anyone ever reported a side effect at that point when it was made illegal? Had there ever been a reported side effect? No, the first study that came out was the next month. It was February 2005, a month after it was made into a Schedule 3 controlled substance where you could go to prison for having it. That was the first study, the one on the screen, and they investigated pregnant rats. And here's a quotation, right? Under these experimental conditions, no significant differences were observed in any of these biomarkers over the concentration range examined. So in other words, they failed to find any side effects. So that's it for the athlete's health. We're banning things because of sport performance, not because of the athlete's health. Nobody cares about the athlete's health. So next up is the unnecessary risk for harm and social coercion. Some people do steroids, and if you want to keep up, right? If you want to compete at that level, you have to do it too, and that puts you at risk for harm. But if you look at the labor laws in the United States, you'll realize forced labor ended in 1865, right? The slavery is not permissible. It has not been for a really long time, which means nobody in the Western world is forced to compete at any level in anything. One is not forced to be a cyclist or a basketball player or a football player. So coercion doesn't apply here. That word doesn't make sense. People are just trying to sound convincing by making this argument. In most major sports, steroids are likely to be a requisite component of elite competition, but you are not obligated in any way to compete at that level. So in the NFL, for example, lots of sports, let's just talk about the NFL. Steroids are necessary, and it's possible you'll get some minor side effects from the amounts that you're taking or the duration that you're taking. It's possible. That's not a legislative problem or a socio-political problem. That's the game. That's what football is. Um, and so, just like other ergogenic aids are necessary in other professions. So to compete in like an MD program or some, competitive doctoral program, you'll probably need to do coffee and maybe speed, right? And sacrifice other components of physical health and mental well-being, you studying into the late hours of the night, that sort of thing. That's how you outcompete people. The highest level jobs in everything are incredibly competitive. And whether they involve steroids, they involve health sacrificing commitments. So like, I just think we should all be forced to compete in the workplace, in school and parenting, whatever it is, with our own natural resources. It's unethical that you drink coffee before the exam and I don't. That's you just can't legislate those things, but neither are you forced to compete at that level. So in the NFL, the average career is like 3.5 years long. It's 6 if you're like a salesman and you have a bunch of exclusionary criteria about eliminating a ton of people and just looking at specific football players. You can get that 3.5 up a little bit. But if you just do a crude assessment, it's 3.5 years. That's the average football duration. People just they get injured, right? And that ends their profession. And this isn't just the NFL, right? Look at youth leagues, evaluate youth leagues, and you're going to see tens of thousands of surgeries every year. There's so much more pain and trauma with the sport participation than you find with steroid use. So statistically, it's the sports that are injuring the athletes, that are wounding the athletes, that are ruining their future health. It's not the drugs, but nobody's making the argument that because football injures athletes more than steroids do, then football should be more illegal than the steroids. So wrapping this one up, and the harm to other people argument, it's not Hunger Games, right? People participate voluntarily. They play, they sign up knowing that like Mike Tyson might punch them, right? They aren't taken by surprise. All of this is voluntary. Nobody's forced to play these games. So the next argument is the level playing field one. Steroids make sports unfair. And we can get through this one pretty quickly. I'm not Andre the Giant, or I'm not 7 feet tall. So how am I supposed to compete in, professional wrestling or basketball or something like this? Um, I had to work full time throughout every day of college. I didn't have the money to afford the trappings, right? I was competing scholastically against people who had all the money to do anything, right? They didn't have to work 8 hours a day to afford life, right? They had time to be at the gym, time to sleep, time to recover. And so of course, I'm bitter that life didn't, distribute its opportunities evenly, but I had way better opportunities than other people. So I can appreciate that life is unfair. But the two places where the unfairness is most meaningful are genetics and familial money. Not steroids. It's genetics and familial money. That's really the unlevel playing field. So this is David Epstein. He's a writer for Sports Illustrated. And he wrote the book The Sports Gene, but he looked at the Centers for Disease Control and at NBA data, and he found that for men in America, if you're at least 7 feet tall and you're between the ages of 20 and 40, there's a 17% chance you're currently playing in the NBA, right? That's not a level playing field, right? That's genes, that's genetics. You have no control over that. And that almost entirely determines your opportunities. And then even in the NBA, height exerts a huge influence over how much you get paid. Again, how is that a level playing field? So if a law existed that only allowed specific athletes access to steroids, that would be unfair. That would be an unlevel playing field. But if steroids were illegal, then the only thing that could be unfair about them is the price. If one athlete can afford them and the other can't, that's definitely an unlevel resource. But that criterion, that applies to everything. So again, the two most important factors for athletics are genetics and wealth. And genetics are an unearned advantage that's only available to specific people through no effort of their own, right? They didn't do anything to deserve their genetics. Um, so it doesn't matter how hard someone tries. Someone with better genes can easily be better than that person with less work. And then wealth, socioeconomic status has such a huge influence over athletic success, way, way bigger than anything steroids could come close to. The sport just really doesn't care about poverty or work ethic, any of this stuff. The sport only cares if the bat hits the ball or the mitt catches it. Or the ball or the puck or whatever passes the goalie, or which body crosses the ribbon first, or if the really heavy ball topples the pins, whatever it is, that's all the sport cares about. And genes and money are how that happen. They really help that happening. Aside from all that, nobody wants an unlevel playing field in the first place. This is just an expression people say. Everything would be a tie, right? And that would bore every audience to death. Every true sport fanatic hates a tie. We want bright, shining stars. Nobody actually wants a level playing field. That's just an excuse people make to bash steroids. So the next argument is that drugs, let's see, steroids specifically, ergogenic aid drugs, contravene the spirit of the sport. And this one involves like purity of sports, and there are these implications of virtue. Conduct yourself with the highest values. This is the argument. So if we were to eliminate doping, we would have the sport existing in its pure form, the purest form of that sport. And then the athletes could compete against each other, right, as God intended. And then there are usually, when you hear somebody make this argument, they make these allusions to, the ancient Olympics, this like paragon of sportsmanship and virtue and ethics and perfection and morality. And this is definitely the most poetic argument, but sports don't have spirits, right? Sports don't have souls. All they are is entertainments. And those entertainments at no point in human history were clean. They were never clean. The history of sports is a drug-addled one. From the beginning of time until today, it's always been filled with drugs. Here's a nice little history of drug use if you wanted to, find the article. But um, this is just a glimpse at some of what people were doing throughout the decades and throughout the centuries. But testosterone was first synthesized in 1935, or to be taken exogenously. Um, it's endogenous since the beginning of time, but to double up on what you have endogenously, 1935. And then in the 50s, that's when synthetic hormones, that resemble testosterone were starting to be used. But that's not when drugs entered sports. And steroids weren't a felony until 1990. And you could totally do them in the Olympics before the 1976 games. So putting asterisks on steroid users today seems funny when they were perfectly legal in the 80s and they were perfectly allowed in the Olympics in the 1972 games and before that. But again, sports, these don't have souls, they don't have spirits, they don't have anything like that to contravene. No sport is sacred. Their only purpose is to entertain people. That's all we care about is entertainment. And today, the head count of dead sports outnumbers the living. Sports just cease to entertain, so they cease to exist. So, like in the Olympics, there used to be in the Olympics, there was solo, synchro, uh, live pigeon shooting, motorboating, right? There's tennis with your hands, tug of war. I mean, some of this stuff still exists, but it's not in the Olympics, right? There's a swimming obstacle race, and these just don't exist anymore in the Olympics because they weren't entertaining enough. And so those sports died. And if someday basketball stopped entertaining people, like, oh, you mean that whole game where super tall people put balls in hoops, that one, right? It would stop existing too, because all it is an entertainment. And I bring up basketball specifically because if regulatory rules, if the game didn't change, if they didn't change the rules of the game and essentially make it a totally different game, it probably would have stopped existing. Regulatory rules commonly change in pretty much every sport. The entire rule book can be changed. Reconstructing the javelin or the vaulting pole. Pads are incorporated into football uniforms. Helmets are added to sports, or a shot clock is added to basketball. The Sports Illustrated, the second link here, how the shot clock saved the NBA from extinction, right? That's from the Sports Illustrated link there. And baseball is another good example. That would have ceased to exist, probably. It certainly wouldn't have any fans. So in 1968, batters, they just couldn't hit the ball. It was a pitching game. It was all about pitching. There were 339 shutouts in one season when Don Drysdale was on the mound. Okay, he pitched a shutout for 59 straight innings. 59 innings consecutively shutout. That is boring, right? So they changed it. They changed the game. In 1969, they dropped the mounds by 5 inches, right? In strike zones, they narrowed them. And then suddenly, baseball was a totally different game. Um, it was a batter's game, and it was fascinating to watch. And so, if baseball had a spirit, that would have contravened it first, right? Because they totally changed, they made it a totally different game. By comparison, right? Steroids don't add a shot clock, right? They don't add pads or construct equipment differently. They don't change the height of a mound or the strike zone. They don't change the strike zone. All they do is slightly improve the athleticism of those participating. They don't improve it as well as some other means. A lot of the resources we have in the 21st century, which cost a ton of money, steroids don't improve it as much as that. And so, like those other resources, those create a massive unlevel playing field, but nobody cares. The typical response why those resources aren't protested is either, well, those things are natural while steroids are unnatural, or because steroids are against the rules. So we'll address both of those, but we'll do. Um, Steroids are illegal. That's going to be the first one that we do is they're against the rules or they're illegal. Here's Joe Biden, right? That's why his name appeared in the last lecture. The Anabolic Steroids Control Act of 1990, that's what made them a Schedule 3 controlled substance, making it illegal to possess them. And look at the sponsor on the bill. That was Biden. Again, before 1990, they were totally legal. Um, and today there are a lot of androgens that are Schedule 3 controlled substances. And this isn't all of them, but here's a big list. And anything that, might be associated with a home run, that's going to be illegal. But just because something is a law, right? It's prohibited or it's allowed, whatever. That doesn't mean the law is good. Okay, so let's look at the Tennessee founding documents here. Who can hold office? Read it, right? It's kind of funny. Uh, are you an aider of someone who bore the challenge of sending a request for a duel? All right, sorry, you're denied the right to hold any office. Um, And then this one, 1977, this one's less funny. This one was repealed, right? In 1977, it was repealed, meaning in 1976, it wasn't. Interracial marriage, right? That was law, right? Was that a good law before then? Simply because it was written as a law, does that mean it was ethical or good? Of course not, right? Just because something is law doesn't mean it's correct or moral or whatever. Um, it's just like what some old people said once. That's what laws are. And more states have dueling or accessory to dueling laws, right, that prohibit people from ever holding public office again. Um, Still in Iowa's state constitution, there's West Virginia. If you go up to Washington, there are plenty of laws about Bigfoot. Right? So maybe you believe in Bigfoot and those laws make sense. Virginia has a fornication law, so unwedded intercourse, that's a class 4 misdemeanor. And then sports have their own laws. Some of them are good, or some of them are silly, whatever. There's a ruling against Luis Suarez. Remember his biting? Luis Suarez was biting people. That was illegal, right, in the context of the sport, and he was penalized for it. In baseball, if you cork your bat, that's illegal, right? It's not illegal according to the police, right? There's no legislation. The police aren't knocking on your door. But in Major League Baseball, it's not allowed, and there are penalties for doing it. Drugs have penalties too. It's not allowed, and there are penalties for doing it. On the right, those are the Major League Baseball suspensions. Obviously, not all of them. It's just some of them. Um, but there are bigger penalties now, right, than there used to be. So in 2004, the rule became a 10-day suspension for the first offense, 30 days for the second, 60 for the third, and a year for the fourth. And there are also penalties for other things, right? It's not just Sarah. There are penalties for stealing the other team's signs if you're using technology to do it. If you're just like smart and using your eyeballs and you're calculating mind, that's okay. But if you use technology, way bigger penalties than steroids. The Astros were fined $5 million for doing that in 2017, and they lost their draft picks. So there's a big penalty for that. And then there are anything that's deemed cheating, right? There's going to be penalties for. So sometimes it's less, severe things. Like in basketball, there are penalties for double dribbling and traveling and fouling. That's all cheating too, right? It's just tiny versions of cheating. So the penalties are tiny by comparison to some of the major things. Now, sometimes people will say, like, well, I'll just do the legal steroid alternatives, but that really doesn't make any sense because the precursors are barely effective. I mean, certainly compared to testosterone. Like androstenedione has, ballpark about 20% of the biological activity of testosterone. DHEA, maybe 10%, somewhere around there. And androstenedione has already been made illegal, a Schedule 3 controlled substance, same exact class as actual testosterone. And that's the only reason is because Mark McGuire hit a bunch of home runs while he was on it. Remember, that's the one that was made illegal before the first ever report of side effects. It was made illegal in January, and then in February, the first report that contained any mention of side effects came out and it said it doesn't have any in pregnant rats. Um, so if the precursor works, it's going to become illegal, and then it'll be in the exact same class as the illegal thing. And so if it doesn't work, there's no reason to do it. If it did work, it's going to be illegal. So that whole argument doesn't really make any sense. So the next argument is natural versus unnatural. Steroids aren't natural, and we shouldn't allow unnatural things in sports. That's the basis of this argument. But corn isn't natural, right? Go to the store and just try to find non-GMO corn. Very little corn is natural. So should GMOs be banned from sports participation? That's not natural, right? And sports aren't natural either. Sports don't exist in nature, right? They're human inventions. With or without steroids, there's nothing natural about the way athletes train for sports. Athletes train in completely unnatural ways to better perform a series of totally unnatural movements. And then beyond that, testosterone actually is natural. All of the endogenous androgens are totally not like Neanderthals had a ton of androgens, right? So, in an evolutionary sense, testosterone existed before humans did. If you're going to do the chicken and the egg argument, testosterone came first. It's far older and more natural than we are. And so, but other than that, like consider blood doping. This is really what people are talking about. Is the unnatural part is blood dope. Think like Lance Armstrong and cyclists who blood dope. They're considered unnatural, but you can take blood out of you and then just wait a bit, maybe spin off some plasma and then put it back in. So you take out your own bodily fluid and then you put it back in you, right? That's blood doping. And that is considered unnatural, right? So obviously that's that you just take something out of you and put it back in. Physiologically, that's really similar to carb loading, right? There's a depletion phase and then there's a supraphysiologic phase, right? That's like, I mean, as natural as if your carbs are natural, but I mean, there are plenty of unnatural substances that go even like within carbs, they go totally unprotested, like polymerized glucose. Lots of these carb loading supplements that people take for marathons, endurance performance, things like that, those don't exist in nature. They're made in laboratories, but nobody protests those, even though they're totally unnatural. And testosterone is totally natural. Now I've heard like that's what happens when you get old. I've heard that applied to older athletes who are using, whether it's growth hormone or testosterone or something like that. Barry Bonds late in his career trying to keep testosterone in youthful ranges, that sort of thing. And so people are being criticized for trying to change the natural course of something or to regain youth that was lost or whatever. But when our vision deteriorates with age, we go to the optometrist or ophthalmologist or something, or we get surgery, we get glasses or contacts, and nobody protests. That's all fine. Nobody's mad at Harry Potter for having glasses, right? And the same thing with hearing, right? Just your hearing goes, people go to the audiologist, maybe they get hearing aids, something like that. Nobody complains about those things. None of that's natural. Those things are totally on glasses. Those don't exist in nature. Then maybe, people maybe they feel tricked by steroids, something like that. Like in sexual selection, there's a body type that's assisted by steroids. It doesn't get passed on to future generations. It's like permanent makeup or something. It changes in appearance in a way that isn't transmitted to offspring. Oh, okay, maybe something like that. But you have to dig really deep to find anything in the natural versus unnatural argument that makes the tiniest bit of sense. So what the truth seems to be, this is the number 9 argument, is that people believe that steroid users are getting something for nothing. The steroid athletes, the like android athletes, aren't paying their dues, that other people are working harder than the steroid athletes are. The steroid athletes are just sitting around being lazy, eating pills, while the hard workers don't see their effort paying off. That seems to be what people believe, but that's not how it works. What anabolic steroids do, what they do best, certainly, is increase recovery, right? Recuperative ability. So you can do twice as many reps and twice as many sets and twice as many workout sessions and be back the next day to do twice as many more, right? Steroids increase work capacity and work recovery, and it allows you to work harder. So I never did them. I never did steroids. The last bodybuilding show I competed in, I was 21 and you had to have, clean pee. And so you had to actually do the drug testing. And then you had to pass a polygraph where they ask you about any androgen use of any kind over the last 7 years, legal or illegal. And when I was young, I was just too scared of them. All the lore about side effects like scared the shit out of me. And I wouldn't know where to get them anyway. But I was just like too scared to even try. But then when I got older and realized they're not really dangerous in the way that I was told, I eventually settled on the reason that I tell people why I didn't do them. And there's some truth to it, but the reason I say it is more to inform people than explain why I didn't do steroids. So the reason I say, if someone asks me like why I didn't do it, I just didn't want to work that hard. That's what I say. Because if you do anabolic steroids and you don't put them to really good use, you're not facilitating the binding of the androgens to your androgen receptor, to the skeletal muscle, to the androgen receptors. You'll just get some estradiol through aromatase enzymes, right? You'll get dihydrotestosterone conversion and get the side effects you don't want, big prostates. So steroids don't give results without work. They don't give a free pass, despite what people believe and despite what they report and say, whatever. So you can think of anabolic steroids as similar to taking Adderall as an ergogenic aid, right? I'm not talking, as a prescription in particular diagnoses, but take it as an ergogenic aid to study for finals or, or write the term paper or whatever it is. If you just take Adderall and then go watch TV all day, you don't do any better on the exam, right? What the drugs do is allow you to study harder, to study longer into the night than you ordinarily could. They allow you to work harder and to learn more information through that increased workload. Steroids do the same thing. Owing to their enhanced recuperative power, they enable people to work even harder. Now, obviously, some people will try to use steroids as a shortcut or a replacement for hard work, but those people aren't actually getting the benefits, right? That shortcut doesn't take them anywhere. Um, and so the people who would just do anything to succeed, including risk their own health, and they're working out as hard as they can, those are the ones getting the benefits, and they're not giving you vicarious liver toxicity, and you're not forced to compete against that person. And so those are the 9 arguments against steroids. None of them make any sense. They're all based on fallacies and false physiology, and but I could be wrong about my assumptions in some of this stuff or my position here. I've just never heard an anti-steroid argument that made any sense. Now, what I'm not counting like kids shouldn't do steroids. Obviously, kids shouldn't do steroids. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about grown adults who have the mental capacity to make informed decisions. That's what I'm talking about. Anyway, that's it for this one. We're wrapping up steroids with that. And here are the review questions. And I will see you in lecture 27 when we talk all about enzymes.